Our next session may be one of the most important of the entire forum. And I can tell you that for me personally, it certainly is. In 1995, my younger sister Mary suffered a terrible break, was hospitalized and diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She worked hard with family and clinical support to return to her previous life. It was an ongoing struggle, and we all rode the roller coaster with her. Bucking the prevailing social norm of keeping her condition quiet, she used her writing gifts, which were remarkable, to begin advocating for individuals like herself, including penning an oft reprinted My Turn column for Newsweek in 2002. She found some balance, but never securely. Last fall, a deepening depression consumed her. Hospitalization, medication changes, therapy, exercise regimens, yoga, family love and support were all part of her treatment regimen. But ultimately, seeing no way out, 6 weeks ago today, Mary took her own life. Our strong family has grieved, embraced each other, been embraced by others, but more than anything, we have redoubled our commitment, which is Mary's legacy, to bring the range of brain-related diseases out from the shadows and advocate for more focus and investment in finding cures. But my experience was not the reason we included this session in the forum. It was because of our friend and colleague, Kenney from J&J, who convinced our advisory board that we could not do a forum like this without doing a session on mental health. To explain why and to introduce this topic, please welcome J&J Senior Director of Thought Leadership, Kenney.
Good afternoon. I have the great honor and privilege of having a role at Johnson & Johnson, where I get to promote and shed light on important and groundbreaking work of people such as Dr. Husseini Manji. Husseini is the global head of neuroscience at our Janssen R&D Pharmaceuticals company. If I were to go through this list of accomplishments, we'd be well into the dinner hour, but there are a few things I do want to mention. First, his long and significant history, 15 years with the National Institutes of Health, where he received the Director's Award for Lifetime Contribution. He's also one of the very few individuals in the pharmaceutical industry who is elected to the Institute of Medicine. He's played a leading role in driving national and international scientific and policy agenda in neurologic and psychiatric illnesses. His work has led to investigations of new treatments for patients, and he and his team are transforming neuroscience from a diagnose and treat model to a predict and preempt approach. So yesterday you heard Alex Gorski and Jack Roppel talk about purpose and mission, and Jim Lear talks about it in his book as well. So I asked Husseini about his purpose and mission, and he said that when he was in medical school, he had no intention of focusing on neuroscience. But once he learned about the complexity of the brain, the brain being the most complex organ and system, and then the staggering unmet need, he decided to devote his life's work to this important area. Pretty amazing mission. So like Husseini, mental illness was not on my radar when I was in school, when I met my soon-to-be future husband and was about to embark on my life of living happily ever after. But it did hit my family, and it hit it hard and really changed our lives forever. So I've never shared this story before or talked about it. It helped talking to Thad and hearing from him, but when Thad and Gloria asked me to introduce this session, I realized there are millions of people out there like Thad and like me who just don't talk about it. And so my story is I married Tim right out of college. Pretty much out of college, but I was too young, he was too young. We didn't recognize the early signs and symptoms of what would become a very significant mental illness. It ultimately destroyed our family and took his life about 4 months ago. Next to me in the picture is my daughter, Catherine. She's 24 right now, And for the past 6 or 7 years, she struggled with anxiety. She's actually doing pretty well, but I still worry about her every day. And every day she worries that she'll end up like her dad. But thanks to the work of people like Dr. Manji, there's a lot of hope for Catherine and for others out there. But we do need to talk about it, because I think if I asked everybody in this room to raise your hand if someone in your family struggled with diabetes or cancer, you might have a hard time, you wouldn't have a hard time raising your hand. But if I asked you if someone in your family struggled with a mental illness, or maybe even you yourself, I'm not sure how fast those hands would go up. And I understand, because I was the same way. And it's not easy to see, we can't tell. But we need to talk about it, because the fact is every single person in this room at some point in your life will be impacted by a mental illness in some way. So we're all here to talk about solving the healthcare crisis. We're talking about new innovations and strategies. But at the end of the day, if we don't make mental illness part of the conversation and part of the equation, we will never be successful. Because people who struggle with a mental illness don't always engage in their health. They struggle to take care of themselves, and they're not in that green space that Sanjay spoke about earlier. So it is with great, great admiration and appreciation that I introduce Husseini Manji.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen, for the very kind introduction. Thank you to Thad and Gloria for the invitation to participate in what I think is a spectacular forum, bringing together eclectic disciplines to really help tackle this monumental problem. And thanks also for your tremendous courage. I think what you've heard is unfortunately very common. And in addition to the sort of biological challenges we face this problem of stigma that causes people to hide things. Most people aren't as brave as Thad's sister were, etc. And collectively as a society, we need to do something about that. As I said, it's delightful to be here at this symposium because we're really trying to tackle things on a holistic level. I think so far in the symposium, you've heard a lot about, the mind-body connection, generally unidirectionally about how important the body is for the brain, and it certainly is. But as you'll hear from myself and my dear friend Tom Inself momentarily, the relationship really is bidirectional. You may be surprised to hear this title that I've used, because we often don't use the word cognitive and mental capital. But if you think about it, what resource is more important in our society than our brain power? And increasingly in our knowledge-based economy, this becomes ever more important. And I think it's a pleasure to participate here, because not only the scientific breakthroughs staggering, the technological breakthroughs are staggering, which are going to allow us to, as you heard from Caren, change the paradigm from diagnose and treat to predict and preempt. We need it badly. In neuroscience, we're dealing with some of society's greatest problems. Most of you have probably heard about this sort of impending tsunami of Alzheimer's disease. This was an editorial from the New York Times by a Supreme Court justice and a Nobel laureate. And they took the approach, so this was going on while we're grappling about balancing the budget, that unless we took care of this one problem, not only were healthcare systems going to be bankrupt, societies were going to be bankrupt. And the reason for that is today we think there's something like 35 million people with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, 100% incurable today, 100% fatal. Every single individual ultimately requires full-time care, whether it's with family or nursing home. And with our aging population that you know well about, the numbers are expected to triple or quadruple by 2050. What's shown on the right there is, I think, one of the fundamental changes we need to make in our thinking. Alzheimer's disease is not Alzheimer's dementia. The dementia is the end stage of a disease process that's probably been brewing for 20 or more years. And we need to intervene very early, long before people have the diagnosis. So if we think today of the person in the top right-hand corner, frail, elderly individual, as having Alzheimer's disease, we need to rethink about it as a person at the bottom, as actually having the earliest manifestation of the disease brewing in the brain. They're not going to present with dementia for decades, but that's where we need to intervene. You heard eloquently from Thad and Caren. At the other end of the age spectrum, we have the serious mental illnesses. And for those of you who are less familiar, these are the studies from the World Health Organization that was published a few years ago, the Global Burden of Disease Studies. They attempted to quantitate the disabling nature of all illnesses afflicting humanity. And they quantitated disability according to a metric called disability adjusted life years. So certainly if you died from an illness, that counted, but if you were ill and were impaired, that counted as well. And what you see on the left-hand side in North America and Western Europe, in what some people would consider people's most productive years, this audience notwithstanding, of course, you see that mental illnesses are by far and away the leading cause of disability. That may surprise people. There's two big reasons. One is that they're surprisingly common. You often don't hear about that because of stigma, etc. Probably the biggest reason is that they hit people when they're very young, late adolescence, early 20s generally, and they're lifelong, so that they're the chronic diseases of the young. If you look on the right-hand side, you look at the individual diseases, and you can see that major depression is the number one cause of disability in the Western world today, and by 2030 predicted to be the number one cause of disability worldwide. You look in the box in the right-hand side, this is something that's also not well known. Unfortunately, there's something like more than 38,000 people who die every year in the United States from suicide, the overwhelming majority in the context of a serious mental illness, which means that there's only 3 forms of cancer that have a higher annual death rate. People may have also heard, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, there have actually been more troops who've died from suicide than enemy fire. So this is horrendous. Lest you think that this is just a Western problem, the World Economic Forum did this analysis 3 years ago, which attempted to look at all the illnesses in low, middle-income countries, etc., and mental illnesses were projected to cost the most of any illness every part of the world. And according to their assessment, projected to cost more than cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory diseases combined. And the last grim stat I want to leave you with is on the sort of bottom right-hand side. Because of stigma, because of some of these factors, unfortunately, we see so many of our patients locked up in the prison systems. There's far more individuals with mental illnesses locked up in state prisons than there are in treatment facilities. And unfortunately, we also see the problem of homelessness, which generally speaking is untreated or inadequately treated mental illness. I mentioned to this already, and again, this almost goes without saying, that the mind and body are connected. And it shouldn't be surprising if you have a condition of the mind, it affects the body. But here's some data. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at what was a seminal study by Nancy Fraser-Smith, which asked the question, if you've had a heart attack and you're depressed or not depressed, how likely are you to die after that heart attack? And they attempted to control for a lot of other risk factors, etc., and were struck to find that you were almost 3 to 4 times more likely to die after the heart attack if you were depressed. And certainly a positive outlook, towards life, etc., is important, but this isn't just the power of positive thinking. These are real biological effects that depression has on the body. On the right-hand side, you're seeing this result of a study that followed about 6,000 elderly women over 7 years, looking at the rate at which they died if they had 6 or more depressive symptoms. And you can see those curves dramatically diverging. And at the bottom, you're seeing a number of these other illnesses that we're really starting to gather data. The likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes, outcome after type 2 diabetes, both pre- and postmenopausal women developing osteoporosis, mortality in the elderly, I mentioned, nursing home, data suggesting that a history of depression increases the likelihood of dementia later in life. So the data is overwhelming, and with all the statistics I mentioned, one would think that we're investing a lot in neuroscience because there's nothing with the unmet need that's greater. Unfortunately, that's not the case. This is a publication from the Institute of Medicine a few months ago, and they looked at publicly available data. So some of it may be flawed, but they asked the question, compared to 2009 and 2014, looking at the big pharmaceutical companies, which ones had maintained CNS programs? And over those 5 years, there's only 3 of them, J&J, Novartis, Roche, and Genentech, which haven't markedly reduced their CNS programs. And in the face of the unmet need, why would this be? And it's really because the brain is so complex, and there's a sense that if you've got X amount to invest, why don't I invest it in something simpler, where I can do a skin biopsy or measure blood glucose, etc., rather than trying to unravel the complexities of the brain and the mind. But many of us believe, and certainly you'll hear from Tom Insel momentarily, that we really are in the golden age of neuroscience. And while there's no question there's a long way to go to really understand the complexities of the brain and the mind, the rate of progress is staggering and breathtaking. And many of us believe that, if we work together, we can really make a difference for our patients. Tom will be talking a lot about some of the breakthrough scientific advances. I'll just touch on one of them. One of the biggest areas of progress in recent years has been our understanding of the fundamental mechanisms underlying what we call synaptic and neural plasticity. We're getting away from the notion that the brain's a chemical soup where you've got too little serotonin or too much dopamine, etc. But these are conditions that affect synapses and circuits, and there are mechanisms that regulate the strength of information flow through certain synapses. So you're listening to this talk. 2 years from now, you may not remember every detail, but you know you were here, you heard about depression, Alzheimer's disease, etc. Your brains are actually changing as we speak to make that information permanent. And a lot of exciting basic science suggested that the trafficking, the movement of certain molecules, AMPA receptors or NMDA receptors, into or out of synapses was a fundamental basis. That led to the suggestion that, depression, as we talked about, is a huge problem. We have many antidepressants, but they don't work that well. And even when they work, it seems to take 4 to 8 weeks for them to work. Why should that be the case? They increase levels of serotonin or norepinephrine within minutes or hours, and yet people don't get better for 4 to 8 weeks. That led to the suggestion that maybe those are the wrong targets. They're far upstream of where you need to be. Ultimately, you need to change AMPA or NMDA receptors. Our existing drugs are starting very upstream. You've got to go through 20 steps to eventually get there. Sounds like a good hypothesis. Does it really hold up? So while I was at the NIH, we chose to do these studies where we brought in treatment-resistant depression. On average, they'd failed 6 different antidepressant trials. Some had failed electroconvulsive therapy. They had been continuously depressed for 3 years, and they were administered either intravenous placebo or very low doses of ketamine, which targets the NMDA receptor, and the results were remarkable. As early as 2 hours, you started to see a robust antidepressant effect in people who had failed 6 things previously. Within 24 hours, 70% of them had responded. And to put it into context, where you see the green and orange bars, that's sort of the historical rates of response you see in less depressed populations with existing treatments. So at 8 weeks with existing treatments, you see something like a 20% response compared to what was seen 70% at 1 day. What's seen on the right-hand side is what some people were very surprised to see. Suicidality isn't just a switch you turn off. And yet, remarkably, in these studies, within 1 hour, you had this remarkable reduction in suicidality. So this has really energized the field in that we can really come up with treatments that could be life-saving and work much better than existing treatments. The area of Alzheimer's disease, I think if you're not in it, you might be very pessimistic. I think those of us who are in it are actually optimistic that we've actually learned a lot about the pathology. So, what happens in Alzheimer's is, unfortunately, a lot of the nerve cells die over time. So what you see in the top right-hand corner would be a cartoon of a healthy elderly brain. And, it goes to what an Alzheimer's brain looks like. And those things that look like butterflies are the ventricles. These are the spaces in the brain that have enlarged because brain tissue is lost. We've known for over a century on the right-hand side on the middle panel, that there's deposition. If you look in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's, you see this thing called amyloid plaques. They're not supposed to be there. We've known that for a century, but what we didn't know was whether that was causal or is it just a scar. Once brain cells die, you put down amyloid. But there have been tremendous human genetic studies, so there's now something like 230 mutations, all of which cause early onset Alzheimer's disease, and they're all in this amyloid pathway. If you have this mutation, it gives you more amyloid deposition. About 3 years ago, there was a study from Iceland where they looked at people who should have developed Alzheimer's based on family history, ApoE genetics, etc., but hadn't developed Alzheimer's, including some who are over 100 years old. And they asked the question, is there a protective gene? And indeed, they found this protective gene, which intriguingly lowers amyloid. So you have evidence in both directions that suggest amyloid really is causally important. The next big area of research is something called tau. So tau is another protein that seems to be abnormal in Alzheimer's. We've known that for a while, but what was difficult in Alzheimer's is that tau is very important inside nerve cells. Now it looks like tau spreads from one nerve cell to another, almost like a prion disease, mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob. So there's a lot of interest in sort of targeting that tau. As I mentioned already, what is a huge learning in Alzheimer's that while we think we've got the pathology right, you can't intervene when someone has a diagnosis because the amyloid and tau changes have occurred maybe 15 or 20 years before the person gets diagnosed. So you need to move the needle much earlier to intervene at that stage and preempt the disease process, and that's what a lot of the research is doing. Is that actually going to be feasible? Can we really identify people who are on their way? On the right-hand side, you're seeing a study which took people with something called mild cognitive impairment. They have some memory problems, they don't have Alzheimer's disease, and followed them over 5 years. And ahead of time, they measured in spinal fluid certain chemicals, amyloid and tau. And if you look on the blue, these are people with mild cognitive impairment, but they had normal amyloid and tau, and almost none of them developed Alzheimer's at the end of 5 years. By contrast, in the red, you have people who have abnormal amyloid and tau, and almost 100% of them developed Alzheimer's. So these biomarkers could help us. So to wrap up this part of the discussion, I think one of the most exciting reasons to be here is that we're changing the mindset. You know, we're getting away from an infectious disease model that we've had. Okay, people get ill, you come in with an antibiotic. We really need to move the needle much more to the left to identify people early on at risk, intervene at the first signs of disease, and then even once they have disease, really focus on real-world outcomes. It doesn't matter whether symptom A is less than symptom B. What matters is, are they back at work? Are they living independently, etc.? And I think the technological revolution you've been hearing about at this symposium is allowing that. So certainly the personalized genome, mobile computing, you know, moving from the reference lab to home care diagnostics, all those kinds of things are helping. I think they're going to revolutionize, for example, how we treat Alzheimer's disease, where you identify people much earlier. You use pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic means to sort of increase the likelihood that you can prevent this decline. Then you want to develop diagnostics. Even today, we could send people for a brain scan or a spinal tap. And from a research study, you can do that. But you can't take every 50-year-old or 55-year-old off the street and send them. So we're trying to develop retinal-based diagnostics that you do once a year when you're getting a glaucoma exam, voice-based technology, you heard from Sanjay Gupta earlier, things in the blood, etc. So I think it's a very exciting time to really be thinking holistically. Same thing about mental illnesses. We need to intervene early. Tom Insel will probably talk a little bit about their efforts in prodromal schizophrenia. We're undertaking a study where we want to identify pregnant women who may be developing depression, because in many women, the postpartum depression is the first time they develop this chronic depression. Intervene there. We want to come up with ways to facilitate adherence, because not being on medication is the biggest risk factor for relapse in schizophrenia, and that's almost toxic to the brain. And I think, as I've mentioned, we really want to think about non-pharmacologic approaches as well. And this idea of cognitive reserve is an important one, which suggests that if you increase people's sort of brain function, you protect them against this decline in cognition. And everything sort of on the left there, I really want to point out, is correlational. So there's data to suggest that if you have higher education, your cardiovascular and metabolic health, etc., is better. You're less likely to develop Alzheimer's. There's little data that's causal, where you've intervened and shown that. But it all sort of stands to reason. And there's data like this. This is looking at aerobic exercise and cognitive function in people. And it's not, you know, saying you're eliminating Alzheimer's, but you're improving cognitive function. In animals, you can show reduction in amyloid plaques with exercise. And to wrap up, one of the things I think I've mentioned a couple of times is we really need to think of beyond a single magic bullet. So we have been piloting with this holistic care models, generally in Europe rather than North America, because North America tends to be a little bit more fragmented. And we're able to show that when we pull some of these things together, you've got things like a 50% reduction in the inpatient stay. And it's not rocket science, it's just thinking holistically. To conclude, I think one of the most exciting things is not only the scientific advances, but the changes in the culture of the science. We're recognizing we need to work together in multiple ways to make a difference. Clearly, part of the reason for showing this slide is to show off this slide with Michelle Obama, but this is really a mindset that's changing. And I think if we collectively are willing to take this on, we will make a difference for our patients. And if you think about it, there really is no health without mental health. Thank you very much for your attention. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce a colleague and a friend, Tom Insel, who's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. I've known Tom for many years, and I did some very seminal, groundbreaking research in the area of affiliative behavior and bonding, primarily sort of facilitated by this hormone called oxytocin, and had a stellar independent research career. before he came back to the NIMH to become the director, and he's been there for 12 years. And under his sort of charge, we've seen monumental changes in the way we think about mental illnesses from a scientific basis, a diagnostic basis, et cetera. And I think, Tom, sometimes we think about, him sort of setting the national research agenda as director of NIMH, but really what he does and the direction he sets the ship on really shapes the world landscape. And you could not have a more passionate, compassionate leader who really cares about patients. So please join me in welcoming Tom Insel. Thank you, Tom.
You said your mic is caught in your hair.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. And Thad and Caren, I'm just humbled by your introduction, which I think speaks to, I'm sure, almost everyone in the audience. We have all had this experience, and unlike cancer and diabetes and heart disease, we tend not to talk about it. And why that is an interesting question, and maybe I'll be quick enough that we'll have some time for discussion. So I think what I'd like to do is not show you a lot of slides, but to follow Husseini's brilliant overview of what you've just heard about mostly neurodegenerative disorders, to say something a little bit more specific about mental disorders. So I'm going to walk through this with you very, very quickly. First point to make is that, as Husseini said, if infectious disease was sort of the model of the 20th century, then what you've already heard today is that chronic non-communicable diseases will be the challenge of the 21st century. And among those, brain disorders, on the one hand, the neurodevelopmental ones, which we used to call mental disorders, and on the other hand, the neurodegenerative ones like dementia, they're the sort of the bookends for this problem. They will be really the most disabling and, as you heard, the most expensive disorders of the 21st century. These will be the real challenge for public health going forward. And the challenge for us, as both scientists and clinicians, is actually we know very little about how the brain works relative to what we know about the heart, the liver, the kidney. We don't even know the parts list of the brain at this point. So we're at a very early point in trying to understand brain function and, as a result, either healthy or not so healthy manifestations of what the brain does. In that respect, there's sort of two areas that seem to be exploding around us, as giving us new insights. One is genomics, which you've heard a lot about today. The other is neuroimaging, which is captured by the President's announcement of the Brain Initiative as the next great American project. Genetics has really opened up the field of mental disorders in a completely new way, and probably the most important part of that is both for autism and schizophrenia, and now a bit for bipolar disorder as well. We've begun to understand that the targets that we'll be focusing on are no longer the monoamines. It's not enough to say that serotonin means that you're a quart, or that depression means you're a quart low in serotonin, or that schizophrenia means there's a little too much dopamine on board. That there are hundreds of different candidates involved, most of them candidates that we didn't even have names for 5 or 10 years ago. So this is a very different realm that we're in, partly because of what we learned from genetics. The realm of neuroimaging and understanding the brain in its most fundamental ways, both in terms of its structure and its function, is also changing because of the advent of new technologies. Just as with genomics, where you've seen already today the cost of sequencing has dropped, the ability to move quickly to find both common and rare variants has really transformed the rest of medicine. That's transforming the study of brain disorders, as well as the ability to look inside the black box of the brain, and for the first time, to identify very precisely where the connections are and which connections are working, which aren't. So both the structure and function of the brain now being available in real time, using a range of different approaches, some of which are going to be optimized by the Brain Initiative, and some already being good enough to be able to identify lesions, whether those mean dead cells or they mean arrhythmias or areas of the brain that aren't functioning in the right way. The question for us, going back to Husseini's comment, is how does one use that science to actually save lives? if there are now over 40,000 deaths per year from suicide, how do we bend that curve? You saw those very high DALY numbers. The most disabling of disorders as a group are the mental disorders, as he said, mostly because they occur in young people and they're highly prevalent. So how do we change that? How do we bend the curve? And what we'll recommend from the NIMH is two things. One is we have to completely change the way we do diagnostics. We have had a language that has really locked us in so many ways. We call these mental disorders, when in fact maybe it's better to think of them as brain disorders. We talk about behavioral medicine, when there's a whole biology underneath that we don't get to look at when we exclusively look at the behavioral manifestations. So increasingly going forward, we want to think about diagnosis here the way we think about diagnosis in the rest of medicine, biology and behavior and environment together, understanding the social and cultural context as well. When we talk about these as brain disorders, in contrast to sort of prototypic neurological disorders where you have dead cells, what we're thinking about for mental disorders are disorders of circuitry. In a way, these would be maybe analogous to the difference between myocardial infarction, dead tissue, versus an arrhythmia, where you have a problem with functioning, but not something that's so obviously apparent in terms of a lesion. And that kind of a change in thinking about diagnosis changes the way we think about treatments as well. So here what we want to think about is not so much a chemical imbalance, which has been the model, unfortunately, for way too long, but to think more carefully about if this is circuit dysfunction, what will it take to be able to rebalance or retune that circuit to get the kind of function that you need. An example of this with depression. This is a model of the way we think about major depressive disorder today. It's a long way from chemical imbalance. In this case, each of the blocks you're looking at is a circuit within the brain. These are various brain nuclei that we know talk to each other and have quite different functions. Depression, of course, is a disorder that involves cognition and mood and vegetative signs like sleep and appetite, as well as self-awareness and insight. And each of those components has a different representation inside the brain. But perhaps most importantly, each of our interventions can target different aspects of that circuitry. Medications hitting one area, psychotherapy is effective here, but hitting a quite different set of gates to get at the fundamental problem. When neither of those work, we now know that deep brain stimulation, actually going into the brain and stimulating, just like you would an arrhythmia, a particular nuclei, and this nucleus called area 25 in the prefrontal cortex midline, is enough to actually reboot the system and change the way that someone's able to function and alter all of those downstream pathways. We've talked a lot about this within the agency that I run to try to actually completely redo the way that diagnosis is done. The term we use is the research domain criteria. It's actually precision medicine. It's the very same thing we're now trying to do for cancer and other areas as well. It's pulling together a whole range of different kinds of data to be able to make a diagnosis that's more precise. And the way we think about this is that at all these levels, we'll bring new and I think really disruptive technologies together to create an information commons. And that information commons is not going to be built only by academics. It will include clinicians, it will include patients, it will include families. The idea here is that this is going to require everybody's joint effort to be able to fill in all the blanks that we don't know about what makes up these various very complicated disorders. A word about treatment. You've already heard that there's an enormous unmet medical need here. I've just listed a few places where the action could be, and Husseini gave you a great example of rapidly acting antidepressants with ketamine. That's a game changer. If now we've moved the goalpost from being a 30% improvement at 6 weeks to now 70% improvement at 6 hours, that is really a profound change. And I only put this up to remind me to tell you that an area which many people feel has not really moved that much in the last few years is actually incredibly exciting in terms of what we can begin to do in therapeutics, particularly in areas like autism and cognitive deficits and schizophrenia. But here it may not be a small molecule, it may not even be a large molecule, but there are other kinds of interventions. Some are devices, and some are in fact forms of cognitive training and psychotherapy that seem to be very effective at being able to tune circuits in new ways. So what we put together here is the idea that you need a range of interventions, just the way we talk about diabetes today, but that the treatment of psychotic illnesses or mood disorders or anxiety disorders can't be confined to looking for another magic bullet. It has to be the ability to put together many different modalities to try to optimize outcomes. We tried to do this in one particular area, which was the first episode of schizophrenia. In the United States, people are usually psychotic for up to 75 to 80 weeks before they get treated, which is extraordinary. If you think about it, the World Health Organization has set 12 weeks as what would be expected or acceptable for someone to be psychotic before they're treated. And what we're hoping to do is by bundling together all of these different kinds of treatments, get far better outcomes. The RAISE project, which is what I show you here, was piloted in 21 states and 34 sites, has begun to do that. It has now been picked up and by Congress mandated to be implemented in all 50 states as of this past year. So we think there's real promise there. So just as with diagnostics, having these multiple levels, here again, you want to think about developing new treatments that use every part of this in a kind of network solution that brings together both the molecular to social interventions that can make a difference. I'll end with this quote from Bill Gates. We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And maybe that's a great way to end the day. I know I'm the caboose for what's been a really exciting day, but I think this concept is one to keep in mind, that a lot of what we'll be looking at in 10 years we can't even imagine today, but it will only happen if we engage quickly and we begin to focus on the near term as well as the long term. Thanks very much for your attention.